Hello, Andrew Colsky from StopMyOCD.com. And today we're going to be talking with Mike Vatter. He is president of OCD Jacksonville and has a lot of really interesting things that he does. So, Mike, could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, yes, Andrew, thank you for having me. My name is Mike Vatter, and as you said, I'm the president of OCD Jacksonville, and it's Jacksonville, Florida, to be specific. I know there's a bunch of Jacksonvilles around, and I am also the host of a podcast called OCD Sharing Our Stories, and I am an OCD sufferer as well.
Great, great. Thanks for all that. And there's some things in there I definitely want to follow up with. But let's start off. Tell us a little bit about OCD Jacksonville, especially for those people who might live in that area. What do you all do? What do you offer? How would someone be involved with you?
OCD Jacksonville has been around for about 30 years, 29 years to be specific. So we're a year older than the International OCD Foundation. We have been involved in everything from fundraising walks, a million steps towards OCD. We've been involved in those. We've been involved in research, raising money for research and education. Just last year, we purchased several textbooks. I believe I have a copy of it. I can hold up if I can find it real quickly. I may not have it in arm's length. I don't know why I didn't think about that before, but it's called the Teen's Guide to OCD. I'm going to mess up the title. But we bought several copies of it and gave it to local schools, which was really great. Oh, here it is. I've got it on my phone, actually. The ACT Workbook for Teens with OCD, Unhook Yourself and Live Life to the Full, by Patricia Ona. And I'll hold up the copy of the screenshot. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, there we go. Good.
There we go. Yeah. So that's the title. We bought several copies of that book and distributed it to local high schools and middle schools. With some money that we were granted. So things like that to help in the community, to help and not only end the stigma, but to also provide research and education to not just the local area, but all of North Florida and anywhere beyond.
Mm-hmm. So with OCD Jacksonville, you all run support groups, right?
Yes, absolutely. Our support group, we have a support group that meets every Thursday in the evening, well, Eastern time, from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. And that is on Zoom. The great thing about that is we started during the pandemic, during lockdown. For years and years and years, we only met in person. Obviously, support groups tend to do that. And we decided during lockdown to move online so that our support group members could still have the support that they needed. And we found that a lot of people around the world were finding us through word of mouth, through our website, and saying, I don't have a resource in my area. People as far away as Moscow, Egypt, Ireland, Canada, saying, I don't have a support group here, or I don't even have a OCD therapist in my area. Can I join your support group? And absolutely, of course, welcome. We'd love to have you. So even though, the lockdown part of COVID is gone, we said we're going to keep this up. And it started out just being, first Thursday of every month, like our in-person group had been. And it was just an hour a month, just like our in-person group had been. But we found, some weeks we'd have as many as 30 people on our Zoom group. And that's a lot to manage. I'm the moderator of that group. And it was a little overwhelming sometimes. So I brought on a co-moderator, which is sometimes my husband, sometimes one of our other board members, and more often than not, it's both. And I'd say, okay, let's figure this out. Let's, kind of co-moderate together. And people, would really need the resources to be longer. So we expanded to 2 hours. And then we expanded to every Thursday. So it's 2 hours every Thursday on Zoom. And when the lockdown ended, we said, well, we want to go back to in person, but we don't want the people who are outside of the Jacksonville catchment to lose what they've been relying on for almost 3 years. So we're going to keep the online every Thursday for 2 hours. But we're going to add an in person. So the first Tuesday of each month, we're meeting in person for people in the Jacksonville area. And again, that all that information is on our website. We also have a once a month we meet online for loved ones of people living with OCD. So if you're the child of an OCD sufferer, the spouse, the parent, and you don't have OCD yourself, but you live with someone who has OCD or care for someone who has OCD, and you want the support group, we've got a support group for you. And if you're an adolescent with OCD, we have a support group for you. All of our support groups are peer led. So they're, people with lived experience sharing with people who have lived experience. So I like to say like speaks to like. So I have this, you have this, we're alike, and we are helping each other. The only difference is the adolescent support group is run by a licensed mental health provider, and that's for anyone 17 and under, and that meets once a month as well online.
Oh, okay. So I've got a lot of follow-up questions from that.
All of that's on our website, ocdjacksnoville.com. So I know it's a lot to keep in our heads. So we try to make it as easy as possible by having it on our website.
No, that's fantastic. So I'm assuming then if you have an adolescent group that is 17 and under, I'm assuming that the regular group is 18 and above.
It's adults only.
Okay, and all genders. There's no breakdown.
Yep.
Okay, and then that's just for people living with OCD. It's a separate group for family members, loved ones, etc.
Oh, that's how it started out originally. Like I said, almost 30 years ago, we said we were going to keep the group separate so that people could have their own sort of separate resource. But we found over the years, people who are living with OCD might say, well, I'm more comfortable if my, I'm 18, but I'm more comfortable if my mom comes with me, or I'm 50 years old, but I want my spouse to come with me. So the loved ones tend to come to the adult group, and vice versa. When an adult caretaker or loved one comes to their group, they don't necessarily want to leave their person behind, especially if that person is a child. So they tend to come to the adult group as well. So we do commingle quite a bit, but the focus of that group is whatever the title of that group is, it's that person who does the sharing and receiving. So like I said, for the adult sufferers group, I, as an adult sufferer, might say, okay, so this week I want to share about an incident that happened. I was at Dollar Tree and I had a panic attack, and I want to talk about that. At the loved ones group, my husband might say, okay, so I was with Mike when he had the panic attack, and this is what I want to talk about. So the focus is shifted. The narrative is shifted based on the person's experience.
Right. So two other questions related to that. The first one is, like I run a support group as well, and sometimes I will get counselors or therapists who want to come to the support group because maybe they're dealing with their first OCD client and they want to learn more about what's going on. Are people like that welcome in your group, or is it strictly the people with OCD?
Are welcome. I have a very strict rule, and this is just the way I run my support group, and it's for the comfort and safety of our members. I operate by Vegas rules. What happens here stays here. So it's that client patient privilege, but also the duty to report that a licensed mental health provider would have. We're peer run, except for the adolescent group, which is a different conversation. We're peer run. So if you're attending as if you're a licensed mental health provider and you're attending our support group, you're attending as a member of the support group. You're not attending as a licensed mental health provider.
Mhm.
So if someone in the group says, I have pedophilia OCD, and I'm having thoughts around pedophilia, you as a licensed mental health provider are checking your duty to report at the door, because as we know, intrusive thoughts can feel very real. And I may feel like I have or am going to act on these pedophilia thoughts, but we all know that intrusive thoughts are just thoughts and we're not going to act on them. If you're a new OCD therapist and you've never dealt with someone having intrusive thoughts before, you may feel like, oh my gosh, this person's a danger to children and society. You have to understand that these are just thoughts. There is no action associated with them, and your duty to report needs to be checked. So that's the rule that we stand by for the safety and privacy of our members.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. It's interesting that you brought up that particular example, because you made me think back when I was starting doing OCD work. A lot of time therapists will have their own little consult groups where 4 or 5 people get together once a week or once a month and just kind of discuss cases. And I was dealing with a case where it was actually a what was he, like a 10-year-old? I forget. It was a child who had harm OCD thoughts and
Right.
all. And, I was just talking about the case with these other counselors, and they were not trained in OCD. And you could see their alarm bells going off of this duty to report duty. And I'm like, no, there's nothing to report. This
Right.
is a thought. It is not an action. And I had to kind of educate them about it. So it's just interesting you raise that, because that is a valid concern. I guess, someone who doesn't understand how OCD works may have that fear that the person is going to act upon the thoughts, when those of us who know OCD realize that that's not the case.
And it can be very scary for the person who has OCD to open up in a group, even if they know that no one else in the group is going to report, to say these things out loud. It's almost like, if I say the thought, it makes it real.
Mhm.
Even to say it in a one-on-one session with your therapist. I have a friend who years ago, and I won't obviously share any information about any revelatory information about him, but years ago he was scripting. He was doing for anyone in the audience who doesn't know scripting, writing out in a journal a script format of his thoughts, his intrusive thoughts. And he was scripting in his journal about harm OCD for himself, suicidal ideation. And he it got very dark, and he was writing it out in detail, and decided, I need to stop, I need to have a drink, I need to, I'm not going to write anymore tonight, I just can't do this. So he got a bottle of vodka, had a couple of drinks, and went to bed. um, but he left the journal and the bottle of vodka sitting on the coffee table. Someone in his family found that scene, and instead of questioning him, immediately called the authorities and had him, in Florida it's called Baker acting, had him Baker acted, which is Baker was a senator who a whole thing, but it's basically a 72-hour hold for mental health, um, for people who are a harm to themselves or others. Um, so it basically had him committed, because of unsubstantiated evidence of something he wrote in a journal. So that type of fear is very real. And so, yeah, people are very afraid, even if they're sharing with their therapist one on one. I thought about pushing my neighbor down the stairs, or I don't know, kicking a baby, and the therapist thinks, well, this person's about to go out and hurt innocent people. That training that the therapist should go through, through a ERP, exposure response prevention therapist training, to conduct that type of therapy with a patient is vital, so that they know what is an intrusive thought and what's actual harm related.
Yeah, yeah. One of the most difficult things, and people who watch some of my videocasts probably hear me say this a lot, but it's really interesting but somewhat distressing to me at the same time, that I speak to therapists, I speak to psychologists, I speak to psychiatrists, and I always ask them the same question, which is, did you learn anything about OCD in your training? And the answer across the board so far to date, 100% of the time, has been no. And it's really, I'm really curious about that, because, like, how can the schools just skip this part when, the more that I know about it, the more that I see it, and the more I'm able to effectively provide, treatment and guidance. And so one of the things that I do, I was fortunate this last year to get a grant from Virginia, the Virginia Counselors Association, to offer training to counselors about OCD. And so we've had a pretty good response to that. But yeah, I mean, if they're not exposed to it, if they've never been trained on it, and they have a client who comes in and describes some of these things you're talking about in their office, most of the time they're not aware of what's going on or what to do, and it scares them. So that's another purpose that I'm doing these podcasts, and I'll talk with therapists and counselors, and they'll share their stories and how they started to learn. So, one other question related to your support group that I wanted to sort of make clear to everybody. In my support group, you talk about how people come from all over the world, which is really, interesting, because I get the same experience. But some of those people, because mental health resources are not readily available to them wherever they happen to live, they come to the support group hoping to get treatment. Have you seen people coming for that, and how do you handle that?
So whenever a new member joins our group, somebody who's joining for the first time, and whether everyone else in the group has been there a million times or 2 times, they have to hear my spiel, and I go through the same spiel every time. It's we operate by Vegas rules. What happens here stays here. Here's kind of a rundown of what we do. Turn on the chat, because in the chat I'm going to share links and resources and book titles and blah 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 blah, famous quotes or whatever, motivational sayings. So I always tell people those things when they join for the first time. And I try to make it as clear as possible. We are peer led. We are people with shared experiences, sharing or lived experiences, sharing our experience with you. We are not licensed mental health providers. This is not therapy. It's just people sharing their experiences. Now, if you need a resource in your area, and if you're in the United States, you can go to our website, which links to IOCDF, or go directly to iocdf.com and do the zip code search and find a therapist in your area. There are teledoc services. There's nocd.org, or nocd.com, which is a online service for ERP trained therapists. There's BetterHelp. There's so many online services you can use. Outside of the United States, though, those resources tend to shrink, because I don't know, and a lot of people in our group don't necessarily know what's available in Russia. May not be available in Ireland. What's available in Ireland may not be available in Australia. And then there's some countries have universal health care where you can just walk in anywhere and get treatment. And is that treatment as good or equal to what you get somewhere else? And the question is, I don't know, or the answer is, I don't know. So we do try to say, your mileage may vary, what happens in your area. And if they say, I don't have a resource in my area, then I try to provide them with as many online resources as I can. But again, I always reiterate that, all I can do is give you the information I have, and what you choose to do with it is up to you.
Yeah, it's I think I have the same type of response, and I try to point them to resources and things. But it's hard. It's hard when they don't have access and there's no one around, and you feel for them, and I try to do my best to offer advice. So now I think you said earlier that you also have a podcast there in Jacksonville. Tell us about that.
So our podcast is called OCD Sharing Our Stories, and it can be found on any of the platforms where you find your regular podcasts. You can also search for it with the hashtag OCDSOS, which makes it fairly easy, I think. And I interview anyone from OCD sufferers to authors to licensed mental health providers. The first season was 14 episodes, and I tried to do one at least one a month. And it was great. I had a lot of fun doing it. We won 2 Anthem Awards for service. We won an award from the Podcasters Association of America, which was great. So we have done very well with it. It doesn't get a whole lot of downloads, initial downloads. It's one of those podcasts that people kind of find later and then share word of mouth. But season 2 is about to drop. Like I said, my producer is working on getting it fine-tuned and getting it on our website. And it's all volunteer. We don't commercialize it at all. There's no advertisers or sponsors or anything. So my producers completely volunteer. I'm volunteer as the host. But yeah, I've interviewed authors. I've interviewed other podcast hosts. I've interviewed people who suffer from OCD and therapists as well. And yeah, it's a great podcast. We really enjoy doing it.
Great, great. I'm glad you're, taking the time to do all these things that you're doing. I don't know how you have time to do anything else in a day based on what you've described already. But
no free time.
Yeah. Well, so, you told us a lot about the support groups, and you told us about the podcast, and you told us about, the organization. Tell us about you. Tell us about Mike. How did you get involved? Why is OCD an interest of yours?
So I have OCD. I'm an OCD sufferer, and I think it's funny. People say, well, do you suffer from OCD? And my first reaction is, I always approach anything that's too heavy or sticky with humor or sarcasm, because I find that that's A, it's my defense mechanism, and B, if you can't laugh at the thing, then it's too serious, it's too heavy, and it probably needs to be addressed differently. But I have not always been able to address OCD with humor, but I find now that I can. I'm at that point in my journey. So when people say, do you suffer from OCD? And I always want to say, no, I enjoy it. It's like, of course I suffer. If you have OCD, you suffer. But I am an OCD sufferer. I was officially diagnosed in my 30s, probably 35 or 36 years old, I think. And so that was about 10 years ago. Yeah, 10 years ago. And but I think symptoms started based on, my parents' recollection, a little bit of my recollection. Symptoms probably started when I was 3 or 4 years old. Excuse me. And little things like I would line up all of my Matchbox cars, my toy cars, by color. So like all the red cars, and then all the yellow cars, all the black cars. But if a car was, yellow and red, then it would be the last, red car, and then it would start the line of yellow cars, and then, et cetera, all the way down. And I would spend hours doing that. And if, God forbid, if a car had yellow, black, and red, then it would be, separate in a different row. And my mom says she remembers it was way before the Container Store existed, but there was a Crate and Barrel or something like that in our town. We lived in Virginia, in the DC area, when I was real little. And she remembers, going to a store like that and buying these little bins, because I separated all of my Legos by color. And then within the color, I separated them by size. So like, if there was a brick that had 3 pegs, it was separated. And then if it was gray, it was separated. And then if it was, had a hinge, it was separated. So I had to have bins for all of my Legos. And it didn't matter what set they came with. And it didn't matter, what they were used for. I separated them. So if it was meant to build, a skyscraper, that was the set that it came with. Once I built the thing, if I ever finished it, I take it apart and separate the bins. And I would be very upset if anyone messed up my organization, my sense of organization. Um, so yeah, signs like that very early on. I have dealt with, as we know, OCD changes, randomly. It seems like, or maybe on a cycle that we haven't figured out yet. But I have harm OCD, which it's kind of I think it's a different twist from what I've heard from most people talk about harm OCD. My harm OCD is more um, kind of germ related, but I'm afraid that I'm going to pick up a germ or a disease, an infection. Not that it will make me sick, but that it will make others sick. So for years, I would wear um, chef prep gloves in the kitchen so that I wouldn't get contaminant from food to food and get the person I was serving sick. So like if I touched raw chicken, wear the disposable gloves, prepare the chicken, throw the gloves away, then prepare the vegetables with different gloves, throw those gloves away, then prepare the bread with gloves, throw those gloves away. And I was going through boxes of gloves a week. Um, I'm over that. That's gone away. But my fear is that I would not get salmonella myself. I'm indestructible, apparently, but I would give salmonella to my family. Um, I don't know why. And I've got hit and run OCD, which is, a lot of people know if you hit a bump in the road, you're convinced you've run somebody over, or hit an animal or whatever. I also have kind of tied to that. If I see a garbage bag on the side of the road, from trash collectors that are, cleaning up the median, or um, maybe a bag fell off a truck. I'm convinced. I just know for a fact there's a body in that bag, a dead body, someone who's been abducted. Maybe they're alive and they're struggling to get out. There's a body in that bag, or it's full of puppies or kittens or a baby. And it takes every ounce of energy in my being to stop, to not pull over, to not stop and check that bag. And just right OCD is a big one. That's been a steady constant throughout most of my life. Um, and um, that one's a really tough one to explain. If you don't have it or you don't know someone who has it, it's kind of like perfectionism, but like a perfectionist will rearrange the chairs in a room to make the room perfect. Someone with just right OCD will rearrange the chairs in a room to make the world perfect. If that makes any sense. And we don't know it's done until our brain says it's done. It's just right. And it may look cattywampus and totally fakakta to everyone else, but to us, it looks just right. Or it may be perfect. It may look visually stunning to everyone, and it could be just off to us.
Yeah,
So
it's like an internal feeling, right?
yeah,
Internally, you just have to feel that it's right.
yeah, yeah. So
So
those are my big ones. And like I said, we have that OCD whack-a-mole where just when you've conquered one and it's like, oh, good, I'm no longer worried about running people over. Oh, but now here's a new one. I can't touch knives. It's like, where did that come from? You know,
well, you certainly have had, a lot to deal with there. But tell us about. So you said you were diagnosed when you were 30. So what led to you even like seeing anybody to get diagnosed, and what did you do once you were diagnosed?
I was it's a long story, but I'll tell you the short kind of Reader's Digest version. Um, I was working for a nonprofit here in North Florida, and we had an event we were based in Jacksonville, and had an event in Ocala, which is a large area of North Florida, but it's the point to point was about a 2.5 hour drive. And we had a rental car, and I was riding with one other member of the staff who happens to be a social worker, but on our staff was working as a peer counselor. I think what was her title, but something along those lines. But she had a degree in mental health. So I was just lucky that she was the one I was riding with. So we spent all day doing the event in Ocala. We're driving back. It's late at night, driving back to Jacksonville. And we're on this big, long country road, not even a highway, just a stretch of country road. No other cars, nothing else to be seen for miles and miles and miles. And I suddenly had the sensation that I mean, I could even picture it in my mind. I had hit a man on a bike. I'd clipped him with the car. He'd gone under the wheels. I'd run him over. And I had to turn around and go back and check. And, my coworker's in the passenger seat, and she's like, "What are you doing?" And I said, I got to check something." She's like, "Okay." So I went up to the closest turnaround point, made a U-turn, went back. After the second time, she was like, "What are we doing again?" And I was like, "Well, I'm pretty sure I hit something. I want to make sure I didn't." And she's like an animal? And I'm like, yeah, whatever. Went around again. After the fifth time, she's like, "Okay, we're wasting. What are we doing? Like, what's going on?" And I'm clearly having some sort of anxiety issue. And so I said, I've hit somebody. I ran somebody over. And she's starting to panic a little bit. Like, "What do you mean you ran somebody over?" And, so we pull over to the side of the road, kind of under a street light. And I get out and I'm looking. There's no damage to the car, of course. There's no evidence that I've hit anything or anyone. And, she's going, "Okay, you need to calm down. I'm now hyperventilating, almost a full panic attack." And she's like, "You need to just sit in the passenger seat. You need to, breathe." She's giving me grounding exercises. And she's like, "I'm going to drive us back. You're going to sit here and process whatever you're doing. Clearly, you've not hit anybody." And this whole process took like 45 minutes of looping around and checking the car and all blah, blah, blah. We get back to Jacksonville, and she's like, "Go home, you rest, you're fine." I didn't sleep that night. Um, Came to work the next day, and she kind of greeted me at the door and said, "Have you ever taken an assessment called a Y box?" And I was like, "I don't know what that is." And she's like, "Well, it's a Yale Brown assessment for, obsessive compulsive disorder." And I was like, yeah, you could be speaking Greek or Chinese. I don't know what you're saying. What are these words? I don't know. And she's like, "Come into my office." And they sat down and we did the Y box assessment. And she said, I'm fairly certain you have what's called obsessive compulsive disorder." And I was like, "Well, I've heard of OCD, but I'm not particularly. I'm a tidy person. I'm organized, but yeah." And she's like, "Yeah." So we went through the assessment, and she's like, "I'm going to recommend you see a therapist." And she gave me the name of somebody. And she's like, "Because this assessment says, in my opinion," she's like, "I'm reading it as you have OCD, but I would like you to see somebody else who is trained in this." And I was like, "Okay." And I'm looking at the assessment and things are clicking, and I'm like, "Oh, that makes sense. Oh, that makes sense. Oh, that makes sense. Well, kind of. Oh my gosh, that makes sense." It's like things are clicking, and I'm like, "Yeah, I kind of do that. Oh my gosh, I do that too." And so I went to a therapist, and it was extremely expensive. My insurance didn't cover it, but I went for a few sessions, and was relieved, because it was like, "Oh my gosh, so many things in my life that I thought, oh, other people do this, they just don't talk about it, or other people have these thoughts, they just suppress them," um, suddenly made sense. And I didn't know it was OCD. But then I found a therapist that my insurance did cover, and spent about 5 years with a therapist that was not trained in OCD therapy, but told me they were. and it set me back quite a bit. And I probably knew more about OCD than they did, and I knew nothing about OCD. And it really, like I said, it really set me back on my journey. It My symptoms got worse. I probably went down the Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole, uh, darker and deeper than I realized I did, to the point that my husband came home one day from work, and I was laying on our bedroom floor in the fetal position, crying. I mean, I had already had the full panic attack. I'm sobbing, shaking, just completely at a loss, because of a typo in an email, work related, that I had sent, that I knew for a fact was going to get me fired, and we were going to be homeless because, the whole, trail of thoughts of like, I'm going to be fired, we're going to lose the house, and, blah, 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 blah. And he was like, okay, what's going on? We need to call Dr. So-and-so. And I was like, no, Dr. So-and-so can't help with this. Trust me, Dr. So-and-so doesn't know what the hell Dr. So-and-so is doing. So, we found another therapist who thankfully was trained in OCD, in ERP, and she actually mentioned ERP, and I was like, "What is that? What is ERP?" And she started doing exposure response prevention therapy with me, and I was like, "Yes, this is what I need. This is helpful." And so yeah, and then she recommended the OCD Jacksonville support group, to me, and that's how I got involved with OCD Jacksonville, and eventually became a board member, and now moderate their support group.
Wow. Wow. So you've had an
Yeah.
interesting journey there.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so some particular questions that I think would be important to ask because I get these types of questions all the time. So when you finally found out about ERP and you started to do that, how long was it before you started to feel any sort of change?
Um, that's a great question. Some of it I would say was immediate, maybe within like a week or so. Most of it I would say was within a few months.
Hmm. Okay.
Kind of depending on which part of my OCD we were tackling,
Right.
and the approach. I found, I'm not with that therapist anymore. I'm with a different therapist now, because she had to retire for personal reasons. But the the approach I think is most effective in my experience and from what I've talked to people in our support group. Um, if the therapist can tailor the ERP to the patient, that's most effective. And I found that that's what I've responded to as well. So, cookie cutter approach does not work for, I think, for any kind of therapy.
Right.
But if they can tailor the ERP, like, okay, so Mike has hit and run OCD. Um, we're going to look at videos of car crashes. Okay, well, that doesn't really help because it's not car crashes that affect me. It's specifically running people over and garbage bags on the side of the road. So let's focus on those specifically and how it makes Mike feel.
Hmm.
So that's tailored to me. Whereas if you have hit and run OCD, it might be running over cats specifically. So let's focus on that specifically. Um, Looking at pictures of bicycles under cars wouldn't help you because that's not what your OCD is focused on.
Yeah.
So I think the more focused it can be, the faster you'll see results.
Right. So you started with ERP,
Mhm.
and did there come a time that you added any sort of medication into that?
I will say though, the therapist that I'm using now has also introduced ICBT. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
So yeah, the inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy. She kind of uses a combination of ERP and ICBT, which I think is even more effective. And I'm really enjoying that modality, or for lack of a better word. And yes, I am on medication. So the medications that I'm on, are kind of a cocktail. because as you know, there's no one medication that treats OCD. Um, but the one that's been most effective, I think, and the strongest dosage I'm on is fluvoxamine. Um, and then I take some anti-anxiety medication kind of around that specifically. So
Okay. So just to follow up on two things there, the meds first that you just spoke about, you know, the medications that are typically used for OCD are your SSRIs and your SNRIs, but the challenge is that the dosages are typically much higher than what would normally be used for depression or anxiety. And it's important, if someone is going to be speaking with a physician or a prescriber or a psychiatrist, because so many people have not been trained on OCD. You know, I've had the experience where the psychiatrists try the right med, but way too low of a dose, and then they say, oh, it doesn't work. And so it's important to talk about the proper dosing. There's information on the IOCDF website. It's iocdf.org, and you can look up about medications. I also have it on my website on stopmyocd.com. I took the same information and just put it there because so many people ask about it. So that was one thing. The second thing is, you mentioned the inference-based therapy, and I just wanted to describe to the people in the audience, in case you all have not heard about that. And actually, in several of my other videos, I talk about the different types of OCD treatment and what part of the OCD cycle they address. And I'm getting ready to put up another video now of what I call the doubt lexicon. And inference space is basically when there's sort of the way that I describe it, because I also incorporate both into my practice, the ERP and the inference space. The way I describe it is, you know, we've got the here and now world. So Mike and I are here on Zoom talking with each other. We can see each other. We know what we're talking about factually, you know, through our site. We can see a computer screen in front of us, so we can use the facts of the situation, and we can use our senses to know what's happening right now. When we move over into the second world, which is the OCD cycle world, that becomes the world of doubt. So everything that we think about, we can't prove is happening here and now. It's all, it might be, it could be, probably, all these other types of words. And so recognizing when we're in the here and now, and when we're moving over into the OCD cycle, and then doing what we can to prevent making that shift, is part of what we're talking about here. But you know, there's a lot more, you know, to it, but that's basically what we're looking at. So it is being used more and more in therapy. And then acceptance and commitment therapy is another piece that tends to be added into exposure therapy. I do that as well. So every therapist is going to have their own style, and you got to match it to your own client. But yeah, it's an important thing to know about.
absolutely. And I think, you know, like I said, the way you tailor it to your patient is so important. One of the things that immediately took with me, and it's very simplistic, but it like I said, tailoring it to your patient is so important. It worked so well with my current therapist, because we do our sessions via Zoom, because she's hours and hours away from me. But she and I work through the No CD app, which is great, through the website. But she has in her office, she doesn't use a virtual background like I do, but she, in her office behind her, there's a door, and she has on the door, there's a hook. And one of the sessions she had a bag, like a shopping bag, hanging on the hook, and it was very distracting because it was bright blue. I said, you know, what's in the bag? And she was like, oh yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. I'm like, oh, okay. And so we're going on and on and on. And I'm not even thinking that she's, you know, that she's doing anything involving this, but the bags on the side of the road, bags, it's in, you know, it's working its way through my OCD brain. And she's very much planned this, but I have no idea. We're doing the regular session. We're hitting on other things. You know, we're catching up since the last session, blah, 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 blah. We're doing other very obvious therapies, but the bag is still there. And every couple of minutes, she's like, oh yeah, the bag. oh, before we do that, let's do this. And she would mention the bag, and then like she'd distract me from it. So it would like pique my interest again. And then at the end of the session, she'd say, okay, well, time's almost up. Do you have anything else you want to talk about? And I'm like, yeah, you didn't tell me about the bag. And she's like, oh, yeah, it's empty. I'm like, what? And she's like, well, I mean, there's nothing important in it. I'm like, so is it empty or is there nothing important in it? She's like, well, you'll never know. And she ended the session. And I was just like, what? Like, she hung up on me? Like, that's the answer? Like, that's not fair. And then I realized that was totally planned, and I have to embrace that uncertainty, and she took a risk, kind of, because like I could have completely freaked out, but we'd been, in sessions long enough to know that that was minor enough that I wouldn't, lose my over it, but at the same time it was okay that I could, it was a minor enough thing that it was kind of a catch, but I liked it. I really enjoyed that because I felt like it was so specific to me that it was like, oh, that was really clever.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed it.
yeah. No, but it's a really important point that you make,
Yeah.
because if the exposure itself does not raise your particular distress, then it's not doing the work that it's supposed to be doing. So,
Yeah.
you know,
My assignment for that session was, for my homework for that session was to journal about my anxiety levels, and which is an ongoing thing anyway. But I immediately was like, writing about the back. I was like, and my anxiety was a 10, but then it immediately dropped to like a 4 because I was like, that's kind of funny, and it was really clever. So good job, It was like, so I immediately was like, the humor aspect of it really spoke to me too. So she totally nailed it in personalizing it for me, which I thought was brilliant.
wonderful. It sounds like you've got a good therapist who really knows what she's doing. That's nice to hear. So, we've talked about a lot of things here, and I really appreciate you being willing to open up and share your own stories. And, the goal that I'm trying to achieve through these video casts and all is to bring information out there to people who maybe they're thinking they might have OCD, but they're not sure. Maybe they're afraid of it. Maybe it's a family member who's not sure. So, for that audience, for people who might be watching this video who are just kind of not sure what to do or where to go or where to even start, as someone who is living with OCD and has been through the process, what's your best advice for them?
I mean, I wish there was a magic wand or a magic phrase I could give them. Um, the best thing I could say to a sufferer is, um, take the first step. I mean, baby steps are still steps forward, right? So go to that support group, go to that, even if it's online, go to that support group and at least sit there. You don't have to share. You don't have to even say your name. Just go and observe and absorb what's happening, and realize there are more people like you. There's no thought you've had or thing that you think you might do or anything you can say that someone in that group hasn't thought worse or said themselves. Um, and you'll realize that you're not alone, um and then take the next baby step, and keep going, um because if you don't do that, your world will get very small very fast, and that is one of the biggest dangers of OCD is your world shrinking, because then you have nowhere to go. So take that baby step, because it's still a step forward. um and then eventually, obviously therapy and if needed, meds. um and then for the family members or the loved ones of the sufferer, um if they're not ready to take that baby step, you can do it for them and go to a support group for loved ones and say, hey, I've got a child spouse sibling, whatever, who is suffering from OCD. How can I help them? Help me help them, and that's a good place to start for them as well. But there's thousands of resources, hundreds of thousands of resources that people just don't seem to know about. I mean, workbooks by, Hirschfeld and Grayson and Nicely, and, so many, Hyman have written all these wonderful books and resources available on, Amazon and IOCDF's website. There's a bookstore on the IOCDF website. You can go to a virtual bookstore. You can find these books and workbooks that you can use to help yourself and your family members. You can download these, a lot of them as ebooks. If you can't afford to have a 50 workbook shipped to your house, you can have them on your Kindle. But use these books as resources. Use us as resources. We've got online support groups. And the IOCDF has a wealth of information on their website as well. But yeah, just take that first step forward. Like I said, baby steps are still steps forward.
Yeah, wonderful. That's great information. I forgot to ask you, for OCD Jacksonville, is there any cost for your support groups?
No, absolutely not. And I do know that there are a few support groups that do charge like a membership fee or a dues or whatever you want to call it. And my predecessor who formed the support group and myself firmly believe that support should be free and open. So no, we don't charge for it at all. The cost of our Zoom, because 45-minute Zooms are free, and then anything beyond that is a charge. So the cost of our Zoom is paid for by OCD Jacksonville. And then the cost of our podcast is underwritten by OCD Jacksonville. And the money that OCD Jacksonville gets is paid for by board members' donations.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Sounds like you've got a lot of stuff going on there in terms of great resources for people. And I want to remind people again, the website to find your resources is ocdjacksonville.com. Did I get that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So for those of you that have been watching today, I really appreciate your time. Mike has shared so many great resources and so much good information. And, you can see he's someone dealing with OCD, yet he's a happy, productive, seems like overproductive person. He does so many things here. But it's wonderful that there's people like him who are doing the work that he's doing and helping those who may not know where to turn or where to begin. So, Mike, we'd love to have you on again in the future. Maybe if you have any particular events or things that you think are worthy of getting out there, more information, we're happy to do that. But we really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to share all this great information with our audience.
Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate it.